everybody, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be discussing Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. So this book discussion is going to be a little different, especially because this is the Juneteenth read that I've decided to do. So without further ado, let's talk about the book. Just to give a little bit of a brief synopsis before we get into what actually is discussed in the book. Basically, this book is a compilation of a letter that Coates is writing to his son to tell him about all of these things that he wants to convey and pass down knowledge about the relationship that Black people have in American society particularly. So, if that interests you, stay tuned. This is my disclaimer. I am going to be discussing this book and what the book in fact says, and I, with my experience as a Black woman, am going to discuss how I feel and how this relates. So don't come at me with these hate comments because they will be deleted, okay? They will be, okay? This book is broken up into 3 chapters, the first of which is detailing Coates' life from childhood to college life, and he grew up in West Baltimore. So I'm going to go chronologically through the book and talk about my things, have some discussion, sip some tea, and yeah, let's get into it. So chapter 1 opens up with him recounting last Sunday's events when he was on a news show. And the host asks him, why does he think that white America's progress was built on looting and violence, right? And he very clearly said, you already have the answer to this question, and that answer is American history. When we think about American history, we see that Columbus discovered the Americas, because we all know you can't discover something if people are already there. So once the Europeans came over to the Americas, we see that there was a genocide towards Native Americans because there was the spread of rapid disease. They were used as slaves. There was a bunch of pillaging and just destruction towards the indigenous people. Then, 1619, the first African people set foot on American soil to be used as slaves. And then we talk about the Civil War, and then we have to talk about Reconstruction after the Civil War, and Jim Crow. All this history basically details how the progress that America has made is based on looting and violence, because all these things involved looting from the indigenous people, looting from the actual land, the actual resources of the Americas, as well as looting from Africa. Know the history. So he mentioned some of this history, and he also wants to talk about how the problem with America isn't the idea of government of the people. It's how the people is defined. We the people. Who are the people, right? Because let's think about who had the power. Who had the power? White men. And not just white men, but very elitist white men. So the fact that the term people didn't include indigenous people, it didn't include people of African descent. Once we had a bunch of migration, it didn't include Latinx people, and it didn't include Asian people. And next we want to get to the first thing that I found was really interesting. So basically he's talking about the idea that race is in fact a social construct. A social construct used to demarcate differences in people based on features such as skin color, nose shape, eye shape, things such as that sort, and to use those features, classify it as a race, and then use that race for demarcation, for separation of ranking of sorts. So he talks about that, and he says that a problem that we see in America is that they see racism and race as natural. There was no accountability, and there still sometimes is no accountability of the actions that made America the country that it is today. And this concept of race and the association with slaves being Black, and the association that creates an unequal shift of African Americans and Black people being viewed as less than white people. White people then have this elevation, and this elevation wasn't acquired through, as he said, wine tastings and ice cream socials, but rather through pillaging life, liberty, labor, land, and to deny the basic rights of securing our own bodies, right? And throughout this entire chapter and this entire book, he talks about what that means about lack of control of our bodies, okay? Like no security in walking outside. You have no idea what kind of interactions you're gonna have with people that may want to do you harm because you're a black person. And then he says, but this banality of violence can never excuse America because America makes no claim to the banal. America believes itself exceptional, the greatest and noblest nation ever to exist. And for me, this just indicates that they are trying to, which sometimes happens, as we can see in our history textbooks, they like to brush under all of these other stories of indigenous people, black people, Asian people, Latinx people, all these things, their history is often not taught. It's very Eurocentric and whitewashed, as if they're hiding all the misdeeds that they have done because they want to preserve this image of being great and powerful when the roots of America's founding was founded on slavery and racism. Addressing his son, he says, and you now know, if you did not before, that the police departments of your country have been endowed with the authority to destroy your body. It does not matter if the destruction is a result of an unfortunate overreaction. It does not matter if it originates in a misunderstanding. It does not matter if the destruction springs from a foolish policy. So this is obviously very prevalent today, as we're seeing a lot of times. I'm filming this ahead of schedule, so I'm filming this today on June 11th. So if anything's happened to June 19th, I wouldn't know about it because I'm filming this on June 11th. This obviously is very prevalent in today's time right now, especially now that we have a lot of people protesting and marching for social change and justice to be served for the unnecessary killing of unarmed black people in America and all over the world, in fact. And so, once again, I'm filming this on June 11th. The time is 3:33 p.m. Central Standard Time. And at this time, Breonna Taylor's murderers have still not been arrested. So when I think about this quote, I basically am thinking about police brutality and how the black community interacts with police. So, disclaimer once again, because I don't want y'all to be pressed, even though I'm not the one to be pressed with. There are good police officers. However, when we look at the system, a system that was never created to protect African American and African descent people, we begin to see the possibilities and the festering of that system into police brutality today. And that's what Coates was talking about. He also talks about how they're usually never indicted, even though there's substantial videotaped evidence. I don't know. This is my thing. If there is videotaped evidence, I don't understand what's to contest. There's nothing to contest because the videotaped evidence shows you what happened. I mean, a lot of times you are told, if you just do this and do that, then you'll be fine. But like, you never really know. It takes one person, one incident that could possibly end in a completely different scenario than what you wanted to intend. Now let me talk about this. So we're still talking about his encounter on the news show, and the host shows him a picture of an 11-year-old black boy hugging a police officer. Now here's my thing, right? Because once again, we're in a very heightened state right now, and reasonably. A lot of times we'll see images like this, or the news or the media will try to show us images like this to say, not all cops are bad, or we march with you, or things like that. But the thing is, do you really know that's their intent? Or is their intent pacification, right? Because Coates clearly was trying to talk about the system. But see, when people perpetuate that system and are perpetuating in that dream, which he discusses later, they don't want to admit that there is a systemic problem. They want to just brush it under the rug and show the nice images, right? It didn't sit well with me. And it didn't sit well with me because I feel like she's using this image necessarily to dismiss his argument, to dismiss the roots and the issues that the black community and police officers, law enforcement, have had since slave patrols were a thing. And to dismiss it and say, oh, here is a black child hugging a white officer and there's hope. Yeah, there can be that hope for that one officer. But when we have other officers not being held accountable, not following protocol, using their power to inflict harm on citizens of the United States that pay taxes that go into the police department, that is where the issue is. That is the problem. And for you to dismiss it by saying, oh, look at this child, it just doesn't sit well with me, because it's once again like they're trying to dismiss our arguments. Every time we want to talk about an issue, they're like, but look at this one time, but look at this one time that something was nice. Okay, that's one time. What we're seeing is happening again and again and again. It's not gonna be solved by a little child hugging an officer. So after he talks about this interview, he goes into the dream. And he's talking about the dream with the cookouts and the block associations and the nice lawns and everyone's having a grand old time. And he's seeing that there's a disconnect between the dream that he's seeing, the dreams that he's seeing on TV versus what he's living in West Baltimore, right? So next, Coates is talking about how his son reacted to finding out that Michael Brown's killers were going free, and how his son was just distraught and how he had to close off and be by himself. And Coates was like, I couldn't tell you it was gonna be okay because it wasn't. And he said, I have to tell you that you as a black person are gonna have to deal with what it means to be American and black at the same time. And I'm gonna insert that quote right there. The next thing that Coates wants to discuss is how can he live free in his black body. And so he's talking about how he's searching for answers. He's searching for answers through research. He's reaching out to his parents, and he's looking at the Black Panther Party movement and how he's reading these novels by these great writers, and he's still confused because what one person says, another person contradicts. And so he's saying that for his son has to try to discover what that means and how it's kind of not possible. And he's contrasting that dream with what he grew up with in West Baltimore, right? And so what he talks about in West Baltimore is the fear that's in that community and how that fear interacts how everybody reacts, right? And so one encounter is that when Coates gets lost at the playground and his parents find him, his dad says, either I can beat him or the police, right? The way the dad explains it is he's saying, either I'm gonna have to hurt my child or the police are gonna have to hurt my child. So I have to make sure that the person who's touching the child has love and has good intention and is not going to hurt the child, right? And so he's talking about how all this violence that he's seeing is actually a result of the fear that comes from not having control over your body. Coates is talking more about West Baltimore, and he's talking about how intentional and purposeful it was that he was living there, that it was predominantly a black community that was living there. And he says, but a society that protects some people through a safety net of schools, government-backed loans, and ancestral wealth, but can only protect you with the club of criminal justice, has either failed at enforcing its good intentions or has succeeded in something much darker. So this all goes to say that it is intentional, right? And this is also addressed in The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. If you want to watch that book review, I'm probably going to refilm it because it was trash when I filmed it. But what it talks about is this perpetual cycle of not having the best education funds, because school funding is based on where you live, it's based on taxes, being denied loans because you're black, being denied certain things that can elevate the status of the community is intentional. And the fact that instead of having all this help, all that's let in is violence and force from outside of the community, it's intentional and it's purposeful to keep that community suppressed. And it's intentional that that community is predominantly black people and other people of color. That's intentional, and that's what he's saying. And he says, it does not matter if the agent of those forces is white or black. What matters is our condition. What matters is the system that makes your body breakable, that makes your body subject to all of these outside forces that you don't have any control over. So if the system is corrupt, even though people in your community may have good intentions, the result is never going to change, right? And so when he's reflecting back on his experiences in West Baltimore, and he's comparing that with the dream, he's seeing the dream as so far away that it's on like the opposite side of the galaxy, like it's worlds away. And the only difference that he can see, that he can reconcile with, is that in West Baltimore, he's black, and the people in West Baltimore are black, and the people in the dream are not. So the next thing that caught my eye while reading was he said, the world has no time for childhoods of black boys and girls, right? From a young age, black boys and girls are subject to certain things. They're subject to being told, oh, you're pretty for a dark-skinned girl. They're subject to being called the N-word. They're subject to all of these things at a young age because their classmates may have parents that are instilling those beliefs into their children, right? So the black boys and girls are subject to that violence as well. And it starts from such a young age. And also, this is off the topic, but there has been research done that says people view black children as older than what they really are, right? And that contributes to deeming black boys as a threat, and also just deeming black women as fast and other things, when really the adult needs to keep their hands to themselves. But what I'm saying is that these factors, the way the world views black children, prevents them from having a peaceful childhood, or as peaceful as it can be, because they have to be aware of all these things that are going on. This is really off the topic, but I read this Twitter thread, right? And this Twitter thread was about a Girl Scout troop, right? And the Girl Scout troop was all black, and it was centered in Detroit. And so because the parents and the Girl Scout leaders wanted these Girl Scouts to have all the experiences, they took them camping. And one of the places they took them camping was, I believe it's Howell, Michigan. I think that's how it's pronounced. But basically, when the girls were in the cabin, the parents had to stay watch because there were KKK rallies going outside of the cabin in Howell, Michigan, right? So that's just saying that the innocence of black children is constantly under attack by forces that they have no control under. Next, we shall talk about the education system. So he says, the schools were not concerned with curiosity, they were concerned with compliance. Schools are not ranked by interests, by maturity of thought, they're ranked by age. And so when we have that distinct gap, it's not about advancing everyone's knowledge and what they're interested in, if that makes sense. It's about, we have to meet this requirement for this course. Otherwise, you cannot pass the STAR English test. That's what it's about, right? And especially when there aren't as many resources, like he said, you don't have the opportunity to expand like in an extracurricular science-y activity club, right? And so Coates is talking about how he feels that the schools are excluding information from them, right? Like, the education system isn't meant to, quote unquote, expand your minds, right? It's meant to reach these certain criteria that the state have established, and whoever controls what that state criteria is controls what the kids know and learn. And so also in this environment, Coates is talking about how he either has to be too violent or he's not violent enough. And at this point, I'm like, this is so relevant to being a black person, right? Like, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't, right? Like, literally. So now at school, we're talking about February, Black History Month. And my thing is, and he mentions this too, it's strategic how they only want to show you the non-violent protest, right? They only want to highlight Martin Luther King. But in his time, in Martin Luther King's contemporary, he was one of the most hated men in the United States of America. And so to transition that to today, to be like, oh my gosh, we love Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., like, he's just great, by like the American people and the educational system, is just a way of, once again, to pacify black people, right? They're only showing that you have to be peaceful in order to get a certain result, right? It's intentional, right? Like, think about it. Like, when we look at the spectrum, we have W.E.B. Du Bois, and then we have Booker T. Washington, right? How many schools can you think of that are named after Booker T. Washington? How many schools can you think of that are named after Du Bois? And that's because if you read The Souls of Black Folk, you know that Du Bois was like, we need to be equal. We as black people need to be treated equal, and we want it now. And Booker T was like, let's focus on education first. There were different approaches. And so when they perpetuate Booker T. Washington, when they perpetuate Martin Luther King, it is to say these are the only leaders that you can accept, right? We don't want to hear Malcolm X. We don't want to hear Assata Shakur. We don't want to hear any of it. We just want to hear about peaceful Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and about Booker T. Washington and how they knew their place and how they were peaceful when fighting for justice. You see what I'm saying? It's intentional. It's brainwashing. It's intentional brainwashing. While we're on this topic of intentions, Coates actually talks about this. He talks about how when people use intention, and personal responsibility, it exonerates them, right? So when someone's like, my intention was not to be racist, they're like, you need to just get over it because I didn't mean to be racist. But the thing is, they still have that responsibility, because if they said something racist and they say, well, my intent, it doesn't matter what your intent is. It matters how it affected that person. And if it affected that person poorly, then you need to take responsibility for your part in how it affected them. You need to take accountability. And he's talking about how America and the dream uses their intentions to not take accountability.